Just so you know, I think we're all caught up to date on uploading the video class from the last few weeks. So if you care to review, or if you know someone that might be interested, be sure and tell them to go to the website. Today we're going to be looking at archaeological evidence for the reliability of the New Testament. Well, that sounds exciting, doesn't it? We're going to start and probably spend most of our time with one of the best historians in history, and his name is Luke. Luke. Of course, he was a physician, he was a doctor, but he was also a fabulous historian. Now, critics have gotten after Luke for a number of different things, and we'll get into that here in a little bit. But there was one particular archaeologist that did not believe that the Gospel or Acts were written by Luke. He thought that the book of Acts in particular was a creation of mid-2nd century. And so he decided he wanted to do a topographical layout of the New Testament, of the places in the New Testament. And the more he studied and the more he looked, the more he felt compelled to recognize Luke as a preeminent historian. His name was Sir William Ramsay. He was an archaeologist, quite noted in his day. And after 30 years of study, he changed his mind. It took him 30 years, right, to come to the right conclusion. Here's what he said, quote, "Luke is an historian of the first rank. Not merely are his statements trustworthy, this author should be placed along with the very greatest of historians." Now let's look at a few things that where critics have taken issue with Luke. The first is the birth of Jesus. If you look at Luke, the 2nd chapter, you're very familiar with this passage, and we talked about it some. Luke, 2nd chapter, first 3 verses, says, "In those days, Caesar Augustus issued a decree that a census should be taken of the entire Roman world. This was the first census that took place while Quirinius was governor of Syria, and everyone went to his own hometown to register." Now the critics would say, well, there was no census. There's no other evidence of a census. He must have been wrong. Quirinius was not governor of Syria at that time. He wasn't governor until 7 or 8 AD, after the birth of Christ. And the third thing that they criticized him for was that everyone did not have to return to their ancestral hometowns. Well, archaeological discoveries, have shown the following. Romans had a regular enrollment of taxpayers every 14 years. I mean, Romans, the IRS is nothing new, okay? The Romans had one too, right? And so they had a regular enrollment of taxpayers every 14 years. Caesar Augustus, was the one that started that process in 9 to 8 BC. Now, it took a while to get the census done. I mean, you're talking about the Roman Empire, for crying out loud. I mean, it took a while, and so it probably took several years. We think Jesus was born in either 4 to 6 BC. Now, how could Jesus be born before himself, right? Well, we get our calendar from the Roman Catholic monk back in the Middle Ages, who calculated the time dating from the birth of Christ, and he was off 4 or 5 years. But we stick with it anyway. So now an inscription found in Antioch mentions Quirinius as governor of Syria around 7 BC. So we have archaeological evidence that Quirinius was governor of Syria twice. Once in 6 to 7 BC and once in 7 or 8 AD. They also found an interesting papyrus. A papyrus for conducting, with instructions for conducting the census. And here's what it said. All residents not living in their ancestral home should make preparations to return to their own governments in order that they may complete the family registration of the enrollment. And they go on to give a reason for it. They say, well, it's so that the tilled lands may retain those belonging to them. They want to make sure the real estate records are accurate. Why? Well, Well, where do you get wealth? And from the land, right? So they want to make sure that the land is productive and it is paying taxes, if you will. So here, these are just three things that the critics were wrong about, and Luke was right. Critics thought that Luke was wrong when he suggested that Lystra and Derbe were in Lycaonia, and Iconium was not. If you look at Acts, the 14th chapter, Acts, the 14th chapter, the first through the 7th verses. Paul is traveling, and he's at a place called Iconium. At Iconium, Paul and Barnabas went as usual into the Jewish synagogue. There they spoke so effectively that a great number of Jews and Gentiles believed. But the Jews who refused to believe stirred up the Gentiles and poisoned their minds against the brothers. Then down in verse 4, the people of the city were divided. Some sided with the Jews, others with the apostles. There was a plot afoot among Gentiles and Jews, together with their leaders, to mistreat and stone them. But they found out about it and fled to the Lycaonian cities of Lystra and Derbe and the surrounding country, where they continued to preach the good news. So what they had to do is leave that province. Luke was suggesting that Iconium was not a part of this province where Derbe and Lystra were. Now, Cicero, the Roman historian, had indicated that Iconium was in that province, so Luke got it wrong. However, Sir William Ramsay found a monument that showed Iconium was a Phrygian city. In other words, it was in a different district or different area. So Luke was right again. Back to Luke, the 3rd chapter, the 1st verse. He talks about a number of people. Dating. This is at the beginning of the ministry of John the Baptist. Luke says, in the 15th year of the reign of Tiberius Caesar, when Pontius Pilate was governor of Judea, Herod tetrarch of Galilee, his brother Philip tetrarch of Iturea and Trachonitis, and Lysanias tetrarch of Abilene, during the high priesthood of Annas and Caiaphas, the word of God came to John. I mean, you see, he's giving this entire historical setting, right? He's talking about who the Caesar was, who the governor was, who the tetrarchs were, who all the players were. He mentions Lysanias was tetrarch of Abilene. Did you know that there was an Abilene in the Middle East? There's a Paris in Texas. He calls him that he was the tetrarch of Galilee. Well, the only known Lysanias was killed in 36 BC. So the historians, the critics, said, well, Luke must have gotten it wrong. Must have. And yet, an inscription found near Damascus speaks of the freedmen of Lysanias, the tetrarch, and it's dated between 14 and 29 AD. One more. In Luke in Acts 19:23, Luke mentions a civic assembly known as an ecclesia meeting in a theater. The critics said that couldn't be. This is a public meeting. It wouldn't be taking place in a theater. But the fact that it did meet there is borne out by an inscription that said the following: silver statues of Artemis, that's the goddess Artemis, are to be placed in the theater during a full session of the ecclesia. When excavated, the theater proved to have room for 25,000 people. And this scene that we find in Acts talks about things going on at the ecclesia. Where do we get the term, or what does that word sound like to you?
Ecclesia.
Ecclesia? Ecclesiastic? It has to do with the church, right? The church is the ecclesia now. Also, one other thing about archaeological discovery is the confirmation that Greeks, that is Gentiles, were not allowed in the temple. Proving that is an inscription found in Jerusalem that states, "No foreigner," meaning Gentile, "may enter within the barricade which surrounds the temple and enclosure. Anyone caught doing so will have himself to thank for his ensuing death." So Gentiles are not allowed to enter into the temple. And there are several words that Luke uses that the critics say he used improperly. One was meris, M-E-R-I-S, translated as a part or district. Luke used the word when he described Philippi, a part or district of Macedonia. Others say meris doesn't mean that at all. It means portion, not district. However, the word has been found in excavations to refer to the divisions of a district. Praetors, it's basically the same thing. He called Philippian rulers praetors. And they said, well, no. Scholars said that two doomfers, I don't understand the word, but would have ruled the town and not praetors. But we found a finding confirms that magistrates of a Roman colony were known as praetors. Polycarp, the same thing. The conclusion we can reach by looking at Luke's history is noting various leaders who were in positions of authority, the timing. He says, we can, as F.F. Bruce of the University of Manchester said, a man whose accuracy can be demonstrated in matters where we are able to test it is likely to be accurate when the means for testing him are not available. So what he's saying is Luke is extremely trustworthy in the way he records events. Now, another character that I want to mention to you is Pilate, Pontius Pilate. You know, until 1961, there was no mention of Pontius Pilate in any documents, in any, no notes, no letters, no anything. So the feeling was, well, Pontius Pilate was a made-up character in the New Testament since he didn't exist. However, excavation at Caesarea, you looked at Caesarea last week, up on the Sea of Galilee. Excavation at Caesarea found a 2-foot by 3-foot inscription in Latin. And it read, Pontius Pilate, prefect of Judea, has presented the Tiberius to the Caesareans. I don't know what the Tiberius was, but it must have been some type of a statue or I don't know what it was. But in any case, that's not the point. The point is that this inscription mentions Pontius Pilate. He says, I presented it to the Caesareans. Another geographical certainty is the Pool of Bethesda. The Pool of Bethesda. Now, after the conversion of Constantine in 333 or so AD, the church began a tremendous building program with the help of Constantine. Sacred places, it was not unusual for churches to be built over reputedly sacred places. Now we have the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, right? We see some of that lately. And so archaeologists used those churches to find some of these sites, and one of them was the Pool of Bethesda. There was an ancient church that was discovered covering the pools. And when excavated, there were twin pools, side by side, separated by a rock partition. There were porticos occupied the four walls and the partition. In 333 AD, a visitor saw and described the pools. And the copper scroll from Qumran gives the name as the place of two outpourings. So we have a lot of archaeological evidence that the Pool of Bethesda is what we think it is. Now there were some interesting excavations at Capernaum having to do with millstones. Millstones. excavations unearthed a significant number of millstones. It's a rocky area, and there were a lot of millstones, more than the people of that area could actually use. So the suggestion has been made that the residents of Capernaum made these stones, grindstones, millstones, and exported them to others because they had so many of them. Hand mills could be turned by 2 women. Larger mills were turned by a donkey. Luke says in Luke 17:35, Jesus is talking. 17:35. He says, 2 women will be grinding grain together. One will be taken and the other left. So he is referring to one of those small, hand-operated millstones. And then he also says in Luke 17:2, he's talking about, he says, things that cause people to sin are bound to come, but woe to that person through whom they come. It would be better for him to be thrown into the sea with a millstone tied around his neck than for him to cause one of these little ones to sin. He's talking about a big millstone here, right? One of the large ones that's being pulled by a donkey. Interesting how Jesus uses the things around him to teach. The temple. Temple was interesting in a lot of ways. We've talked about it a good bit. The Temple Mount itself, the area where the temple was built, is the largest site of its kind in the ancient world. It would hold from 25 to 30 football fields today. That's a big one. Interesting, it was just in the news, wasn't it? You know, Donald Trump at the Wailing Wall. The retaining walls rose approximately. The retaining walls. These aren't this actual structure itself. The retaining walls rose approximately 10 stories above the outside street level. Now I'm telling you this because in Mark 13:1, his apostles say to Jesus, look at these buildings, look at these stones. Mark 13:1. As he was leaving the temple, one of his disciples said to him, look, teacher, what massive stones, what magnificent buildings. And you know what Jesus' reply was, right? You see all these great buildings? Not one stone here will be left on another. We've looked at that already. But the point is they were marveling at the size of the stones and the retaining wall of the holy place and the Holy of Holies, that column, that tower, if you will, in the very center, probably was about 14 stories high. Now, to get an idea of how high 14 stories is, just take a look at the high-rise downtown, the big apartment complex. That's about 14 stories, just to give you an idea. The smallest stone blocks weighed from 2 to 5 tons. And one of the largest measures, 40 feet in length, one of the stones. 40 feet in length, 13 feet in width, 10 feet high, and weighs 400 tons. How in the world were they able to quarry those stones, transport them to Jerusalem, put them in place? It's amazing to me. That's why it was known as one of the wonders of the ancient world. And they have found these stones in the foundations. You know, all the buildings are long gone, but the foundations, much of the foundations are still there, and that's where they're finding these huge stones. And Josephus also speaks of 162 columns in 4 rows, each column 27 feet high. He says the thickness of each pillar was such that 3 men might, with their arms extended, fathom it around. So how big around is that? You know, what's my, I don't know. Big. It's pretty big, right? It was indeed a striking and awe-inspiring building and grounds. No question about it. And finally, the creme de la creme is the empty tomb. Now, I found out something very, very interesting about the empty tomb. And you know the scene in Matthew 28, 11 through 15. We looked at it the other day. the soldiers came and reported what had happened, and the chief priests and the leaders gave him money and told him, hey, you spread the word that his followers came and took the body. And the writer says, and it's been spread, that word has been spread around to this good day. Well, word of the empty tomb apparently reached the ears of the governor. The ears of the governor, because there was a lot of hubbub about it, right? He, in turn, must have communicated with Rome on the subject. I mean, it's his responsibility to report to Rome. Now, the emperor, probably Claudius, sent back word to Palestine with a decree in Latin. I'm going to tell you what the decree says in just a minute. The decree was posted in, of all places, Nazareth. Nazareth, an insignificant little bitty town of no prominence whatsoever, and yet there was a decree from Rome posted there. The lettering style was that of the first century. It was probably done after AD 44, but before AD 50. Claudius ruled from 41 to 54 and expelled all Jews and Jewish Christians from Rome. Expansion of Christianity troubled him, and when he learned of the empty tomb, he issued this decree. Here's what it says. I didn't write it down in my notes because it's too long. Ordinance of Caesar. Can't you just see the soldiers there reading it? It is my pleasure that graves and tombs remain perpetually undisturbed for those who have made them for the cult of their ancestors or children or members of their house. If, however, anyone charges that another has either demolished them or has in any other way extracted the buried or has maliciously transferred them to other places in order to wrong them or has displaced the ceiling of other stones, against such one I order that a trial be instituted, as in respect of the gods, so in regard to the cult of mortals. For it shall be much more obligatory to honor the buried. Let it be absolutely forbidden for anyone to disturb them. In case of violation, I desire that the offender be sentenced to capital punishment on charge of violation of sepulchre. Wow. The emperor himself is testifying that this has happened. A tomb was empty. And in trying to stamp out Christianity, or at least slow its expansion, he says, you can't do that. He is suggesting that he heard the story. He probably received this letter from the Procurator of Judea, and regarding not only the empty tomb, but the expansion of the Christian religion. The Jewish authorities had contended it all began when the disciples stole the body of Jesus the Nazarene. Hence the posting of the decree in Nazareth. Isn't that amazing? You know, other religions and faiths, if that's the right term, have their own ancestral buildings and cities, but they can't be found. One in particular is Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. If you read the Book of Mormon, and it's tough reading, I'll tell you that right now. If you read it, there are cities and armies and all sorts of things that are mentioned as being in the Western Hemisphere. None has ever been found. Not a single thing. In addition, they make mention of things that couldn't have been here during the time frame that the events in the Book of Mormon take place, like glass and other things. The point I'm trying to make is the Bible has been used to find cities over and over again. And we just scratched the surface really today in the archaeological the archaeological finds, discoveries that prove beyond a shadow of doubt the validity of the New Testament. And I contend that when there's a place where it doesn't seem right to us, let's approach it from our shortcomings, right? Our limitations. Say, well, it doesn't seem right to me, but if the Bible says it, I kind of have to believe it. Next week, I want to take a look at some archaeological discoveries that took place in Old Testament times. I mean, the Old Testament archaeological finds that prove its reliability. And then when we finish with that, I'm not sure exactly which direction I'm going to go, but I'm probably going to do a series, and I'm going to call it Bible 201. This is Bible 101. Now we're going to do Bible 201. And the first thing we'll look at is the Old Testament survey. And then we'll probably do New Testament survey. And eventually what I want to do is study the life of Christ as recorded in this gospel, in the Gospels. And we'll harmonize the 4 Gospels to see if it makes a little more sense to us. That's down the road. So that's kind of where I'm going with this. I hope you're enjoying it. So let's have a prayer time. Who do we?
The Ayton family.
The Ayton family, yes. The son of our former pastor passed away yesterday. He had cancer.
Lisa this morning, we were going to bring her to church, but she has a sore throat, so she can come. But she hopes next week.
Okay, she's hanging in there, huh?
Hanging in.
Bless her heart. Anyone else? Well, let's stand. Mitch, would you dismiss us with prayer, please?
Lord in heaven, it's so good to be in your house. We just thank you for the validity of the Bible, Father, and the knowledge that we can rely on it. And Lord, I pray that others too would see the validity